Welcome to Elixir Mix, your weekly Elixir podcast talking with members of the community. My name is Mark Ericksen, and today we have on our panel Michael Ries.
Hello, everybody.
And Chuck Wood, of course, it has to be here.
Yeah, I'm here, Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv.
And we also have a special guest today, is Connor Rigby.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
Connor, I know Michael knows you and has some experience. So maybe, Michael, you can kind of introduce Connor as a guest.
Oh, yeah. Can we do it like conference style? I'll measure this based on how many eye rolls I get out of Connor. So Connor is deep into the world of Elixir and Nerves. I believe that are you a core member of the Nerves team?
Yeah.
So working on the Nerves project. Also, Connor is someone who's well known in the community for just being very experimental. So having done all sorts of things like getting Linux running on devices that you may not think Linux can run on, building lots of projects. If you are ever in the mood for a good giggle, you can look up at his GitHub page and look at all the various things that he has started, and he'll publish them as prototypes, and you can then go and play from there. I think that has created a really kind of fun culture within the Nerves community that is part of the overall Elixir community. So that's something that I've always really appreciated. And then Connor, can you maybe give us a little bit of self-intro, especially maybe around your current work?
Yeah, so aside from like doing random hobby projects, I actually do use Nerves in production. I work for a company called Farmbot. We make automated farming robots. So it's like a 3D printer, but for plants and things like that. So that device itself does run Nerves, which is kind of what drove me to begin using Nerves. I just do all the hobby stuff for fun.
So this is interesting. I didn't realize that because I followed you back in when I remembered seeing tweets around things like a Nerves system for the Nintendo 3DS. Yep. Was that after you had already started to work on Farmbot?
Yeah, so I think I've worked at Farmbot for like somewhere around 3 years now. I've been working with Nerves for longer than that. I don't know when the 3DS system initially got bootstrapped. It was probably around the same time I started working for Farmbot. Or at least that's when it started working.
So did you have a lot of experience doing any embedded systems outside of Nerves and just with other types of hardware? Yeah, I've
been doing embedded Linux for quite a long time. So my job before I worked at Farmbot, I was doing like kind of a custom thing. I didn't know Erlang or Elixir existed yet, but I found the Nerves project way back. I think it was 2014. They were still using Elixir barely existed, and it was still based around Erlang. And so I started using it then. And then I don't know when I migrated to Elixir, because I initially started with Erlang and migrated to Elixir fairly shortly after.
Yeah, if I remember the history right, the Nerves project, Frank's initial versions were based around Erlang, right?
Correct.
And later moved to Elixir?
Yeah, I want to say around 2014 is when it got the Nerves badge. Justin Schneck, I think, is who initially kind of got it more Elixir-y and mixy.
So I'm curious, never having done any like IoT or embedded development myself, I hear about how awesome Nerves is to work with, but I'm just curious from your experience where you've actually done both sides, what are some of the benefits that you've found with Nerves that, might not be obvious?
Yeah, so I say this a lot. The Observer is just A plus. Like, that is the coolest tool. There aren't any other comparable applications in any other project. So I've used ROS, which I think stands for Robot Operating System, though I'm not sure. It's mostly C++ and Python, and your only analytics into the system is just like sending log messages to some sort of shell or whatever. Like you don't get any performance information. Like if something's not working, you have to actually have a brain to debug what's going on. With Elixir and Erlang, you have a shell right there. You just ask it what's going on. So yeah, the runtime tooling is excellent. The build time tooling, really cool. We use Buildroot, which is a package that's been around for probably a million years. And that's basically what builds the Nerves, or the Nerves build time is based on Buildroot. So that is we wrap it really well, but that wasn't a huge thing for me. It was mostly the runtime tooling.
Yeah, I'm imagining some ancient Mayans with the first versions of Buildroot.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is. Chuck Moore, probably, he was in there.
Yeah, actually, and I have to say, the runtime tooling was one of the things that sold me. The production systems that I shipped are mostly web-based, but that same runtime tooling is so amazing to have there, because so many of the projects I've ever shipped to production, do I have a metric for whether or not this thing's working? Well, it just depends whether or not I ever thought about it and put one in. And if I didn't think about it ahead of time, I probably don't have any insight into it. And tools like IEX, remote consoles, where you can actually open an IEX terminal in the process, not oh, I'm on the same version of the code, but I'm literally in the same memory space, and I can ask the different processes what they're doing. I can see the VM stats. I think that's actually that's one of my favorite things in the overall Erlang and Elixir ecosystem. And then it feels even maybe just one step more magical in the world of embedded devices compared to in the past when I did things like Atmel chips. And, and you compiled some crazy variant of C to get the code running, and there's no runtime at all. Yeah, the runtime is just the code you wrote, and that's it. So there's benefits to that. It can be a cool thing if you're really into that, but if you just want to get a product out the door, it's really great to have some runtime tooling.
Yeah, having Linux underneath everything makes everything really nice. We could have built the robot using some a STM32 or some other embedded chip and done it all there, but man, it just would have been it would have taken so much longer. It would have never been nearly as robust. You get fault tolerance for free with Nerves and Erlang, Elixir, stuff like that. Stuff that you would have had to build fault codes in for. It's just there.
Now, one thing I have to say is Farmbot is just really cool. When people talk about Elixir, they're like, man, have you seen when they talk about Nerves, have you seen Farmbot? And I just think it's really cool. People need to go to their website. It's farm.bot just to see videos of this in action. It's
we're the only one with the .bot domain right now, I think, too. So
did you guys pay for that? You manage the top level domain now?
No, we don't manage the top level domain. I think Amazon owns it, but we're the only one that has, as far as I know, at least when we got it, we're the first one.
Sweet. Pioneers.
Yeah, that's an important piece of information.
So I know with a lot of your work, you're also kind of maintaining other libraries and things that are useful. And
most of them.
Sorry?
I'm just kidding. I maintain a lot of them, yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of them, SQLite. I imagine that can be very handy on an embedded type system.
Yeah, it's very handy. ETS is a good alternative to SQLite, but if you don't want to learn ETS, boom, SQLite. Because ETS is a little bit complex, and SQLite is not.
Yeah, if you're already comfortable with SQL.
Yeah.
Where with ETS, you're kind of having to generate your own filters.
Yeah, ETS is a little tricky.
Actually, I would love to know, have you ever shipped any Nerves devices using something like ETS or DETS? in a production setting, or have you almost always just gone for SQLite?
Yeah, so for the initial, I think, so Farmbot's versioning is a little weird. We have hardware versioning and software versioning, and the software version pre V5, I think, so like 2 years ago, used ETS and Amnesia, actually. Both of those things were used in production, and they worked all right. They had their caveats, just like SQLite has its caveats. I mostly like SQLite because I like Ecto. Ecto's a really nice project.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I was helping to maintain the SQLiteX package for a little while, which I originally got involved in just because I was looking for a package to work on, and I had some previous experience with SQLite. But it was really good to get when you offered to kind of take over some ownership of the SQLite Ecto package and the SQLiteX package on Hex. That was a big boon, and so it's good to hear that that's in production. Do you know of anyone else using that in projects right now?
I do, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say who they are. They're pretty NDA. That's kind of happens a lot in the embedded world. Is people aren't super thrilled about sharing their embedded code, so it's very hush hush on a lot of projects.
Is that partly because they just, I don't know, they kind of obscurity, or they want to, like, it's kind of considered secret sauce, or what are some of the
I'm not really sure. The place that I worked at
when I was at Codebeam, there was a company that was actually saying, we tell everybody we use Java or something else, and they considered Elixir to be their competitive advantage, is what they were saying.
That's funny. But yeah, I'm not sure what it is about it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No problem. Yeah, I'm not sure what it is about embedded that just warrants. Everyone seems to be very quiet about whatever they're doing. There's a company, Rose Points. They kind of were among the first to use Nerves in production. Garth Hitchens, I believe, is his last name. They have or at least I believe they're still shipping a Nerves product. It's sort of an old version of Nerves, but it is a Nerves product still, and they're very quiet about all of the Nerve stuff they do. We get a lot of people wanting to use a particular package, and then they'll fork it and then make quite a few changes to it, and then like changes that we could really use, but they can't contribute it back just due to their company not allowing it.
Yeah, that's something at least I've noticed a little bit doing a bit of hobby Nerves, is that as I've talked to different people like Frank and Justin and yourself, it does seem to be just part of the ethos of embedded companies.
Yeah, it's a little strange.
Yeah, it's too bad, because I think for people who are looking to learn Nerves, it would be really helpful if they knew, for instance, oh yeah, there's multiple products shipping, and these are their experiences. And I really appreciated that Rose Point early on did share. Garth, as you mentioned, had a couple of conference talks where he talked about their initial experience with Nerves and how it worked really well, and it was faster to get things into market. I really wish that there could be more of that, but it feels like it's going to take a while, because it's just going to be a matter of more of those companies getting comfortable with open source.
Right. Yeah, I think Garth's talk 2015 at Lone Star Elixir was the first Nerves talk I saw, when he just like pushed a firmware update live on stage to a BeagleBone Black. And I was like, yes, that is exactly what I need.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of the early adopters of Elixir kind of came from the Ruby community. I think they inherited a lot of that kind of open and sharing of, hey, here's a gem. I'm extracting logic into a gem that can be reused. And you're kind of doing a lot of that with like hex packages too. So I think that's a beneficial thing that we've inherited as far as culture. So maybe it can kind of start to bleed into Nerves. That'd be cool. Like,
yeah.
I mean,
Farmbot's
just
full open source, so.
Yes, and people should know that. So talk about that a little bit, and how the business sees that.
Yeah, we, I think, use it as like kind of like a business rather than a negative, like a positive. Like people are kind of stoked to see that the thing they're buying is open. You know, they might not even fully understand what that means, but they're like, hey, that's a cool thing to say. It's kind of just like a nice talking point about the company. It doesn't really have, I mean, as of right now, knock on wood, it doesn't have any negative drawbacks of fully open sourcing everything. There are some weird things like there are some weird requirements being fully open source. You can't use proprietary systems behind the scenes just by nature, right? So like, I'm not sure what an example would be because I don't use any of these things, but like Jira is a paid service, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we don't use Jira, any of those kind of things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can you, one thing that comes up a lot, so I'm part of a meetup group where a bunch of nerves, mostly just hobbyists, get together about once a month online and just chat about the projects we're working on. And one topic that comes up quite frequently is around testing. So there's, testing for embedded devices is always a little bit different by nature, but then also you have a very different sort of deploy experience than if you come from a web background, like a lot of the Elixir community does.
Right.
Are there any things that you try to do in the way that you test? Do you specifically push for property-based testing, or anything else? Any other tools that you feel like have really paid dividends as you try to ship your Nerves code into production?
So Jose wrote an article, I don't remember when it was, like 2014, 2015, about mocking. And it's probably the first thing you read as an Elixir developer. That is basically the best resource I can give about testing for Nerves, because it's honestly the only way to test on Nerves. They're like, there isn't really any other option. If you have for example, Farmbot uses a UARTs device to talk to a motor controller. To even test that without it being plugged in, you have to mock that library. You have to sufficiently wrap it in a way that is testable. So you just have to write, you can't just write your code and then test it later. You kind of have to start with testing. That said, I'm not a great TDD developer. I try to say I do it, but with Nerves, you get a lot of there's just a pretty large disconnect between actually testing on hardware and what are you actually testing? Because a lot of times you end up just testing for typos, which I mean is good in itself, but the compiler checks for typos.
Do you guys do any sort of releasing code to some test devices that you can watch or put through their paces before rolling it up to the public devices?
Yeah. So we have probably 10-ish Farmbots that we do all of our QA on. I do a combination of, I have Circle CI that runs actual tests, but obviously those can't catch things in real life, when you tell the motor controller to go to a specific position and it just doesn't, you can't test that. You just have to, there has to be a human looking at it and say, wow, that didn't work. What went wrong? So yeah, we have a combination of both. I'm also on the NervesHub core team, which if you haven't seen yet, NervesHub is super cool. It's I like to call it like Heroku, but for Nerves devices. It has a lot of really cool features that are going to allow better kind of QA and testing. So Justin's been kind of pioneering this feature, but the idea is that you have a subset of devices on your NervesHub account that have a special version of your firmware that can run X units, but on the device itself rather than on your host machine, or some test framework. I'm assuming X unit. I haven't used this yet, but I'm assuming it's X unit, and you can run your actual tests on devices, and then it reports up somewhere to say code coverage or whatever about your testing, all of your tests that pass or fail or whatever. So I think that's kind of a cool feature.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. When you're trying to, that was one of the things I became kind of amazed with when I started to learn about microcontrollers and, the software that runs on those, that, you have to take the physical world into account. right? Like there's electricity and there's temperatures. And when the temperature changes, my chip runs faster or slower. So my timing gets off, it's like, so it's a whole another level. So I don't know, is there anything you want to say about that?
So, like those comics you might see on like XKCD or something that says like, your unit tests pass, but your integration tests fail. And it's like some guy reaching through a fence and opening the lock. It's basically a lot of that. Like I have like infinite unit tests, but there's still no way I can catch a problem in the real world. Like something catastrophic happening, like the bot ripping itself out of the ground or something. So, it's a weird, thing, especially when explaining it to like, say, a web developer. Like for some reason, it's just like as someone who's only ever worked on Ruby on Rails, just it is basically impossible for them to understand that there are just some things you cannot test, and it gets a little tricky.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated to hear more about NervesHub as well. So one of the things that I was really excited about for NervesHub, those who haven't seen it, part of what it's trying to do is it kind of keeps track of your devices that you have running in the field. So like in Farmbot's example, end customers, anyone on the internet can basically order one and then install it in their backyard. And if something goes wrong, Connor doesn't fly to their backyard, I don't believe, on a drone to fix this. Not yet. Maybe that feature's coming.
Yeah, we've done a couple house calls, but usually we don't.
Yeah. So then one of the things that comes up with that, as you can imagine, is there's just more variability. You control less of the environment where your code's running, and in this case, where the robot's running, and you still want to provide things like continuous delivery. So you still want to provide updates to those devices, and you want to provide some security around that. So one of the things I know about NervesHub is that Frank was working on a little embedded chip that would actually be on the device, and it will be a secure key, meaning it like has a private key. It can sign things for you, but it's impossible to get the key back out. And that becomes a good way to verify that I'm shipping this update only to the devices that I originally shipped out, because I can verify that they can still sign things correctly. Are you guys using some of that or any of that so far at Farmbot, or are you waiting for it to mature a little bit more?
So NervesHub does enforce key signing whether you have the special device or not. Farmbot ships on a Raspberry Pi, so basically security is a gray area. I won't say there's none of it, but there's not a lot of it. I mean, you just walk up to the device and take the SD card out, and security owned. Haha. So yeah, the Raspberry Pi kind of limits the amount of security you can pack into it. But we will hopefully be using the Nerves key on our next batch of production devices. The Nerves key, that's what Frank calls the little hardware key. Basically, either way, if you use NervesHub, you have to have signed firmwares, and that's that. Like, there's no way around that. But the Nerves key is it stores the validation on the key itself. This allows, like, so if for some reason your firmware gets leaked or whatever, you can't decrypt it without the key. All these things. And industrial applications and closed source, people who don't open source their firmware are super into this kind of thing. It's basically a requirement for them.
Interesting. So NervesHub is allowing, as we talked about before, there's a little bit of this cultural difference between some like the Elixir community, which is very into open source and publish everything on Hex that you can, and the embedded devices world, which is traditionally very closed down. And it sounds like NervesHub is an interesting bridge. And Farmbot is not into closed down source, obviously, but you guys are still using it for some of those features. And does that mean that you basically have like an RSA key pair that is on the SD card that you shipped in your firmware? Yeah.
So it actually for Farmbot get provisioned at runtime because we have some weird. I won't go too much into our weird requirements, but because of it being open source, we also open source the hardware, so people don't have to buy the kit directly from us. They can just build one in their backyard if they want, which means that they can just go buy any old Raspberry Pi, not directly from us. So you have to flash the firmware on the device yourself when you get it. This means that it won't be configured with our NervesHub keys, so we have to provision them at runtime. It's a little weird. Most companies will not do this. Actually, I'm pretty sure Farmbot's the only one that's ever done that. But yeah, it's a really weird situation to be in, because for about a minute and a half, you can have a Farmbot that's connected to Farmbot's backend services, but can't receive OTAs, over the air updates. So it's a little weird and backwards, but yeah, so it just stores the keys in like a secret area of the SD card. It's not like there's a file called like, public key.pub and .priv on the SD card. Like, you got to go rooting around for them. They're there. They're not particularly hard to find, but yeah. And so that's either way, like, because NervesHub has a WebSockets kind of situation going on with Phoenix channels, where there's always a connection open between your device and a NervesHub, or as long as your device is connected to the internet, obviously. And to be connected, to be like a valid device, it has to have these keys. So you have to somehow get the keys on there while also not having the keys to begin with. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting to hear about from my perspective, because on the one hand, you're working around some interesting requirements. You are different than a lot of the other companies shipping devices. But to me, I really hope that the message, I really like, if you go to Farmbot, that message of openness and, hey, if you want to go build this yourself, you can. If you want to 3D print some of the repair parts yourself, you can do that. I think that message is really resonating. And I hope that will turn into additional companies choosing to take on a little bit more of that market positioning. Because I do think it's a market advantage for Farmbot to be able to say, hey, we're fully open source. And I know a little while ago, Farmbot had some sort of interaction with NASA. I don't know very much about this. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more, but I know that NASA is required to be open in certain ways. And so I imagine that your openness made that partnership more feasible.
Yeah. The trip to NASA, that was, let's see, a year or so ago, maybe two. They had this open source summit, I believe is what they called. So NASA is traditionally very closed source. They don't want any of their precious codes being released, probably due to, the Cold War, right? We don't want the Russians getting to the moon first. So we don't want, so recently, over the course of, I don't know, maybe the last 5 to 10 years, NASA has become a little bit more okay with open source software, as they realize they have a smaller and smaller budget and less time and resources to build things themselves. They haven't quite embraced opening of their side. Like, they're willing to take the open data but not give it back, which is a little weird. They haven't quite figured it out yet. But yeah, so we went there along with like MIT and a couple of other groups based around like agriculture and farming. And they want to, I'm not sure they know what they want, but they know they liked it. And they know that, I don't know, we haven't heard a whole lot back from them after we all went. Like, they shipped like 5 or 6 companies out there. We took a tour of the facility and they're like, we want to do something, but they couldn't quite pinpoint exactly what it was they wanted out of all of us.
Maybe we'll see Farmbot on Mars.
Yeah, that was, so MIT has this project called Food Computer, and it's kind of similar to Farmbot in that it's an open source project for growing food. Their approach was to, rather than physically control the plants like Farmbot does, they control the environment in which the plants grows in. So like, they have something like, it's like the size of a mini fridge, I think, that controls like a few plants they control the environment around the plant rather than the plant itself. So NASA's idea was like, hey, why don't you guys just like put the robot inside the food computer, and then we'll put it on ISS and we'll send it to Mars. And they were super into not doing the thing themselves. They were kind of like trying to make us do it for them, essentially.
Wow.
Yeah, we haven't heard a whole lot back from either company. I'd like to progress more on that, but both of us are a for-profit company, and they're kind of, NASA doesn't have a huge budget, so.
Right.
This episode is brought to you by Triplebyte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, Triplebyte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. Triplebyte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/elixir. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through Triplebyte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
So one of the things I did want to mention about NervesHub that I think is worth pointing out, because it is open source, like you do have these companies that are more secretive by nature or by culture. But as I understand it, NervesHub can be self-hosted, right? So
correct. That's one of the big selling points. Yeah. So Farmbot uses the open free, the production available version of NervesHub, but a lot of companies aren't into they don't want their closed source software being hosted on the same server as like my weirdo open source software. They're like, I don't know about that. So yeah, you're fully able to host your own NervesHub instance. And we fully expect that to happen. Like, Frank Hunlith, he works at SmartRent. And they're, one of the traditionally closed, they're more open than most in that they're allowing their developers to work on, these open source projects such as NervesHub. Like SmartRent is one of the companies that kind of initially got the NervesHub project started. So they are more open than most, but they're still not willing to let their firmware just be hosted on any old server. So they're going to be running their own instance of NervesHub, from what I understand.
Thank you for giving some of the feedback on that. It's really interesting to hear. I think of NervesHub as kind of one thing, but it is kind of this whole spectrum of running it yourself, running it with really strictly following the key protocol of signing things and provisioning them ahead of time, versus all the way to Farmbot's usage of we'll use the public NervesHub, but we're going to do a kind of custom key provisioning process, which again I just think is amazing that people can totally go build their own Farmbot, and you guys are actually willing to let it connect to your backend and let it be managed by your backend.
Yeah, what gets even weirder is when people want to host their own backend of Farmbot to connect their home-built Farmbot to. And they're like, how do I get OTAs? Well, now you also have to host this other completely different thing that you had no idea existed. We have a hard time managing our resources on, how far do we go helping someone who's literally never touched a computer before set up their own instance of a Rails server?
I can imagine that not being an easy process.
Yeah, we've had to kind of cut back on it a little bit because when we're doing that, we just don't have time to, help support the actual project itself. If we're just spending all of our time being DevOps engineers for, some dude who's never touched a computer before, it gets a little annoying.
Yeah, maybe it's becomes a profit center. You're well, you can pay for this kind of support. And
we've been considering doing that. Yeah. I think we have 5 developers on the Farmbot team right now, so it's not even like if we could help, we would. We just there's not a whole lot of people. There's not a whole lot of man hours available.
So you mentioned in there that there was a Rails server as well. I'm just curious, like if there's anything you can say kind of about how the systems are kind of work at Farmbot and what kind of, where is Elixir? Is Elixir primarily just in the Nerves piece or anything about
Right. Yeah. So let's see. Hold on. So we use Rails as the back end. The front end is like a web app. It's like a TypeScript project. Elixir is only on the device itself. And we have RabbitMQ also, because Rails can't do many connections very well.
Right.
As you've probably seen before. So yeah, we use RabbitMQ to kind of bridge the two. We've talked about rebuilding parts of the Rails side in like say Phoenix or something, but again, we just don't have the manpower to do it right now. We might need to in the future. Right now, it's working okay.
Well, that's all really, really cool stuff. I'm thank you for sharing a lot of that. One of the things I do want to kind of come back to is we talked about in the intro, Michael was kind of mentioning that you play with a lot of unusual things. And that's really cool. When I think of TDD, I think of, TDD makes sense when you kind of have an idea of what it is you're building, but it doesn't really make sense when you're kind of doing a spike. Just like, can I even make this work? And so I totally understand what you're saying before about like, well, I try to do TDD, but what if you're doing so many like spike oriented stuff, maybe you can't. But I'd be curious to hear about some of the recent projects that you've kind of launched and shown and shared with people, and just anything that you have going on.
I won't say launched, but I've abandoned a lot of products. So I think probably the most recent one that everyone kind of has seen is I did like an Elixir OpenCV wrapper and some other like computer vision stuff with Scenic. So I don't know when I started that or when I abandoned it, but probably a couple of months now. So I was super excited to see Scenic come out. If you haven't seen Scenic, it's a open source project like for user interfaces and other things of the sorts. It's a really really neat thing, like alternative to say doing like a web app for a user interface. You can use Elixir to do you can use Elixir to do interfaces that just run directly on Elixir itself rather than having to do HTML, JavaScript, all that nonsense. So that's a really cool project that I've been just like having a lot of fun with. I did facial detection with it, which was super cool. Like just seeing Elixir detecting faces was a really neat project. It was not very performant, but I didn't try to make it very performant. I hacked it together in like 4 hours. But just seeing it there was just a really cool thing. Like I expect it'll be like if someone really wants to, I'd be happy to, put more time into it because I think it would be really cool for like a Nerves device. I know they're a consultancy that have shipped a couple of Nerves devices, at least 1 or 2 Nerves devices. And they did like a facial detection system for a beer tap, if I remember correctly. But I don't think any of that got open sourced. And like, it kind of got me thinking like, man, this is a cool use case for Nerves, like having Nerves detect a face, do a thing, open a door, whatever. So I kind of started all that. I got it up and running. It's not great right now, but I mean, I do that a lot where I'll start a project and get it to like a running state. And then just like, well, if someone else wants to push this over the edge, go ahead.
I want to say a big thank you actually for that, for you helping to cultivate that culture. I think so many people, as I've done Nerves hobby work, a lot of the hang up, a lot of the difficulty getting into it is just not knowing like, well, is this idea possible? Is that idea possible?
I try not to think if it's possible or not. I just go with the assumption that it is possible until I am proven otherwise, which I'm usually not proven otherwise, turns out.
Yeah. And, but I think as you do that, and as you create all of these breadcrumb trails behind you of GitHub repositories, I've at least benefited from at least one of those in the past personally, just because I was like, oh, I wonder if anyone's ever done something like this. And now when I have that question around nerves or embedded devices, I usually just try to search Twitter for your Twitter handle and whatever like Lego Mindstorms. Could I do this on a Lego Mindstorms? I don't know. Connor's probably tried to do it. And so I think those are actually really beneficial, because it helps a lot of other people who maybe are a little bit more worried about, oh, is this possible? And just seeing that somebody got it running and having a direction to run in is a big benefit. So I'll just say a big thank you on behalf of on myself and also some of the Nerves community, at least, for building a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm happy to see someone's getting some use out of it. A lot of time I started with like intent to use it at like Farmbot or at some other project that I'm working on. And then like it just gets backburnered to the point of where it's just a hobby thing at this point. Like the Farmbot has a camera on the end of it, and we do some object detection. But right now it's done using Python and OpenCV, which has no Elixir bindings at all. Well, there's OpenCV bindings for Elixir now, but I wouldn't ship them in production, being that I wrote them. But yeah, so we use Python to do our object detection. And one day I'd like to have that done just all with Elixir, all with natively, like not have to shell out to Python for this kind of thing. So that's kind of what started that project. And I've made some progress on it, but it's nowhere near production ready yet. Like I'm not really interested in putting what is currently there on all of the production Farmbots.
So yeah, along those lines, actually, I'm curious, generally when people interact with a C library from Elixir, you kind of have two major options. You can either build it as a port where it runs in a separate Linux process and you communicate with it, versus having it run as part of the VM.
I'm full team NIF.
Yeah, are the Elixir CV bindings, OpenCV bindings, they're a NIF? Yeah,
they're a NIF. I like ports, but for the stuff that I want to do, I usually need something a little bit faster than ports.
Cool. So is speed the main benefit you're getting with that?
I like the API for using NIFs better. Ports seem super kind of like not hacky, but like you're using std-in and std-out, which if anyone's never done C before, well, I mean, that goes to other languages, but like imagine like if you're trying to write a Ruby port, you would do, I think puts is the print string function in Ruby. Like you would just like puts your data, and then on the Elixir side, you're essentially doing gets, and it's weird. It feels weird. It's not like what I would normally think for C bindings. So I mean, it works for some things. A lot of the Nerves projects, actually, I don't think we have on the Nerves root or the Nerves root organization. I don't think we use any ports. We have quite a few C dependencies. But I'm sorry, we don't have any NIFs. I misspoke. We only use ports because they are arguably safer. Like when you write a NIF and you mess something up, the whole VM goes down, which is less than ideal in a system that's supposed to be fault tolerant. But there are certain things that's like recently Elixir AL, which was a project for interacting with GPIO on embedded devices, not necessarily just Nerves, but anything with Linux on it can run Elixir AL. Frank renamed it to Elixir Circuits and rewrote the GPIO, SPI, and I2C code in NIFs because the old versions weren't quite quick enough. So speed is something you get with a NIF, but I prefer it just for the API personally. You get a more of foreign function interface kind of situation.
Yeah, I'll say one other reason that listeners might consider when they're thinking about ports and NIFs. So I did a Nerves project. There's a school bus that comes to pick up my son from my house. I have a son who's autistic, and when the school bus comes, we have like no windows on the front of our house, so we never know when it's there. So I built a little webcam, and I wanted to add. Well, the first version is it's just kind of it'll just stream basically to my wife's phone so that she can see when the bus has arrived. And when I was getting that working, one day one of my kids went upstairs and they were messing with the device, and they unplugged the Raspberry Pi camera from the Nerves device.
Oh, man.
And when they did that, it crashed the C code that was controlling the camera. But that project, it's called PiCam on Hex, if anyone's interested. It actually does run as a port, and so it's actually passing the JPEG frames over that standard in, standard out. And so what was interesting is as I plugged it back in, and my device had continued operating that whole time. It had continuously tried to restart, and the camera would like wait a few seconds to hear from the hardware, and then the C code would crash because it wasn't built to handle people. They didn't think of my 5-year-old when they were writing that C library. And
the tests couldn't catch it.
Yeah, there's no unit test for 5-year-olds for sure. And so it was amazing to me to see that kind of level of resiliency in a project where I hadn't thought very much about that as someone putting it together. I just kind of hacked together a webcam over a weekend and was trying to solve a problem at my house. So I think it's amazing when community members like Frank really put in the time to make a very solid NIF. And they're going to do a lot of work to make sure that it's very stable and doesn't ever crash. And I have never heard of anyone seeing crashes with Elixir AL or with Elixir circuits. So I'm glad that people put in the time. But one other reason that you might consider it is if there's some existing C library that maybe doesn't have the best reputation for fault tolerance, and you want to stick it into a fault tolerant system.
Yeah, there are certainly examples of libraries out there that I would probably not write as a NIF, either just due to my misunderstanding of them, or they are known for things like crashes. Like OpenCV is a really well put together project, so I was cool with that being a NIF. OpenCV core probably is not going to crash. I mean, people use it in production systems, so I guess it's just a level of risk you're willing to take. SQLite is a NIF as well, actually, which is another library I help maintain. And that's never given me any issues.
Yeah, Michael, that's a really good point.
I'm waiting to see when you have, you're using OpenCV and you're doing bus recognition.
It's on the way. I had one false start with it, trying to use something that was not OpenCV. And just couldn't get the training accurate enough. So it was actually just more annoying than helpful because it would notify us like if just a car drove by on the road.
Just any kind of motion.
Too many false positives. Yeah. So, but anyway, I'll take another crack at it, and maybe there will be an open source buscam.bot domain before too long. We'll see. Well, there's one other topic I was hoping we could touch on before we wrap this up. I saw recently that you retweeted some information about the GRISP board. GRISP is a different approach to putting Erlang and Elixir on embedded devices than Nerves. It doesn't try to have a Linux kernel running from what I understand. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what got you excited about that project?
Man, I love Pierre. He's a cool guy. He's the one who does GRISP. So I first talked to him, I think, Erlang Factory, when it was still called Erlang Factory in like 2015. And I saw that he's creating this project, and I was just stoked. Like, I don't think I'll use it personally, but man, I'm just cool. I think it's so cool that it's going to exist. So basically, the idea is that there's no overhead between pressing power and Erlang starting, right? Like, there's no operating system, no kernel in between. So, I mean, like, there's quite a few hurdles to jump over. Like, Erlang assumes that there's a kernel and there's an operating system underneath. So, like, bridging that gap must have been, like, a huge undertaking for him. But I think it's going to be a super cool thing. You get real-time guarantees, like hard real-time, not, what you say real-time when you have, like, a WebSocket API, like hard real-time where something needs to take exactly 0.2 milliseconds, and it takes that long. And I think Erlang's a really cool fit for that once it gets like up and running. I know GRISP V1 has been up and running, and he's shipping products with it. I think mostly for industrial automation, but GRISP V2 is using like a Linux compatible board, which means that Nerves can run on the GRISP board itself. Nerves won't be running in the same hard real-time environment as Grisp is, but it'll be running Linux kernel still. But it'll be cool to see those two communities kind of exist on the same device.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see the Kickstarter they had for Grisp v2 has already been matched. It's going to close 5 days from when this is being recorded, so it's probably closed by the time any listeners hear this. But we'll drop a link in the show notes. Definitely an interesting thing to check out, and just an interesting alternative, like you said, to the world of Nerves, which is very friendly to the, we live right now in a time when there's lots of Linux compatible boards that you can cheaply get a hold of. And that's amazing for getting up and running with prototypes. Grisp is a really interesting alternate way of getting up and running with a project pretty quickly. And I did see that Frank mentioned there is some compatibility there. It sounds like they would actually, in that case, ship a unikernel of some kind, just so that Nerves can still make those assumptions about the world.
The idea is going to be that you have to choose one or the other. So you'll have like the option of using the Grisp runtime, which is just bare Erlang. But if you don't need that, you can also run the Linux kernel just like on Nerves. There won't be. You won't be able to do both of them at the same time. There won't be any like custom unikernel or anything like that. You have to choose one or the other. But the idea is that you do get to choose one or the other. So if you're looking to ship a board, like right now, your options are fairly limited to like what device you choose. You can if you're not looking to spend a bunch of time porting Nerves, which believe it or not isn't actually that difficult. So shipping the Raspberry Pi, I wouldn't recommend shipping a product on it. It's a cool device, but it is not necessarily the most reliable if you're trying to ship tens of thousands of them. On the other hand, there's the BeagleBone Black series of boards, which are super battle hardened. Those are more than capable of shipping devices on, but they're a bit expensive. And there's a fair bit of R&D needing to be done to get the initial system up and running. And so hopefully with Grisp, the idea is that we'll both have the shared development board that we can both being Grisp and Nerves kind of document how to get started in hardware development. Because that's a big barrier to entry, is deciding where do I find the hardware? How do I source it? How do I get it with the correct things on it? Right now, the options are, you have the BeagleBone Black is kind of what most of the companies shipping Nerves use. I think all of them actually are using the BeagleBone Black series of boards. And it'll be cool to have another option.
Nice. Well, I know we're going to have to close up, but one of the things I just kind of want to touch on is, are there any projects that you're playing with on the side right now or have an idea for that you just think is kind of cool and interesting?
Not that I'm willing to share yet. Maybe next time.
Awesome.
Oh, he's back in the closed source world.
It's open thought, right? Yeah. All right. Well, let's move to picks then. Michael, do you want to go first?
Sure. So my first pick is a conference talk that happened at CodeBeam San Francisco pretty recently. So there was a talk by C. DeGroot, and he talked about mixing C and Elixir, and he spiked out this idea, which he also readily mentions as not being production ready. But he uses the Elixir macro system to generate C code and then generate a port. And so he can basically write some code and any sort of really basic data transformations, he can port that or generate C code from that. And then under the hood, it'll compile a port program for you and handle the Erlang term to binary and binary back to term so that you can communicate with it. And he has an example where he's rendering 50 little birds, he calls them boids, and they're doing kind of a visualization of flocking kind of behavior. And he was rendering that using something similar to Scenic, but it's not Scenic. And this was kind of his project for getting that up and running. I thought it was just I had never thought about using the Elixir macro system as a way to generate code that runs outside of Elixir. And I just thought that was really cool. Another great example of someone just being experimental and starting off with the hypothesis that this is possible. And sure, of course, there's got to be a way to make this work. And then sharing something with the community. So I found it a really entertaining talk, interesting, and probably has some application somewhere. But for me, mostly just fun.
Nice. Yeah. That is really interesting. I'm gonna have to check that out. But one of the things that what I was going to share was, in case anyone hasn't heard, as of the recording of this is on April 23rd. Recently, it was announced that Joe Armstrong passed, and Joe Armstrong, if you weren't aware, was one of the 3 co-creators of Erlang, and he's very engaged with the community. Continued to, even in his retirement, he would come and speak at conferences. He's very open and friendly. And so what I'm picking is the announcement by Francesco Cesarini, who we've talked with before. He is one of the CTO, basically, of Erlang Solutions. And he announced it. And it's a great Twitter thread because a lot of people is kind of adding their thoughts and memories and sharing their experiences with Joe Armstrong. And while I've never personally met him, I benefited a lot just because of what he has built, but also because of his writings. They have very much influenced me. So I just wanted to kind of pick that little announcement. And then, a lot of people have been sharing blog posts and things like that about their memories and their experiences with Joe. And so I just think that's something to I don't know, pay respect to, is just and appreciate what we have with Elixir and what it is built on, that is truly built on the shoulders of giants. And that's my pick. Chuck, do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, it's interesting with this announcement. I saw it as well on Twitter. And it was Francesco's tweet where I saw it. It was just interesting too, because there have been a few other notable people in the various communities, JavaScript and Ruby in particular. And what's interesting is that, even years after some of these people passed away, you still see people like commenting on issues on their GitHub accounts or things like that. Just, sharing a story or just, hey, we miss you or whatever. And anyway, it's terrific to see that he was able to have this kind of an impact. And that people can share their thoughts and feelings. It's also interesting to me as well, since I'm heading to a funeral on Thursday. My wife's grandmother passed away. And so, you see again, what people mean to other people. And that's kind of the biggest life hack out there, is just recognizing what matters, and who matters. And then, doing what you can do to have an impact yourself. So
yeah, anyway, making a difference.
Yep. I'm kind of rambling, but that's kind of some of the thoughts I have. I'm also going to pick, Michael has a meetup group that he mentioned it already, where they do the hacking with nerves and IoT. And so if you want to check that out, you can. I'm sure he has the link more readily than I do, so I'll let him put it in the show notes in the chat. But it's pretty awesome. So I went and joined up, and of course I miss all the meetings because that's the way I am. But anyway, I love the idea, and I really want to show up and do some interesting stuff. So yeah, that's my pick.
We'll be happy to have you, Chuck, when you find the time.
Yeah, things are a little bit nuts right now. Oh, one other thing I'm going to throw out there. I've been working on a podcasting system. You can find it at podwrench.com, like wrench, like the tool. And I'm going to be looking for beta testers here within the next few weeks. So if you are interested in starting a podcast and helping me beta test the software, it is written in Rails and not in Phoenix. Anyway, so I'm working on that. So you definitely go check that out as well. I'm going to be offering kind of the, here are the management tools for podcast, and then here's the full service offering where we do all the production and show notes and everything for you. So anyway, the main pitch is that you should be able to show up and be an expert in the things you want to show up and be an expert on. And that doesn't include audio production. So we'll go help you find sponsors. We'll use the sponsorship money to pay the production team. We'll take a share of that, and then you'll get the rest. So cool. that way, as you get going, as you build an audience, and as you're able to monetize, or we're able to monetize for you, then we can take all that headache away, and you can just be awesome as a podcaster. So anyway, that's it. That's all I've got.
That's awesome. Connor, do you have anything you can share?
Yeah, actually, I think yesterday, April 22nd, or maybe the 21st, I'm not sure. Someone released a project called GB Studio, which is a Game Boy, original Game Boy kind of game creator and editor. I believe was released on the 30th anniversary of the original Game Boy. And it's a super cool project. I've been building a couple original Game Boy games over the course of probably 5 or 6 years in pure assembly, because there was no C compiler. Wow. So I think this is it's a really cool project. I haven't used it yet, but it looks like it's going to be really fun. I'm going to try to.
So is this a lot? You're able to flash these onto little cards that actually stick in the hardware?
Yeah, so you can get, I would imagine it produces, I haven't used it yet, so I'm not sure, but I would imagine it creates ROM files that you can play in an emulator for testing, as well as you can flash them to a real cartridge and play it.
All right, well, Connor, it was a pleasure talking with you today. If people want to follow you online or connect with you, where should they go to do that?
Just look at my GitHub, github.com/Connor Rigby.
All right, we will have a link to that in the show notes. All right, well, that is it for today. We hope you'll join us next week on Elixir Mix.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.